Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Imam Marc here from Middle Ground, and I just wanted to share some thoughts that I had about the new movie, Bilal, a new breed of hero. Um, for some reason, this has been a very controversial film for certain people, and I've seen a lot of negative commentary about it, and I've had people asking me what I thought about it, so I guess I'll try to be brief and concise here and share some thoughts. So, number one, I like the film. I thought it was, pretty well done. Um, the artwork was, it was okay. But then again, my oldest brother, Mike Manley, is a comic book artist, animator, right? So I have perhaps a more discerning palate, for that kind of thing. But overall, I thought, alhamdulillah, it was fairly well done. I enjoyed the narrative, the story. So yeah, for me, like and then I'll give another reason in a moment of why I really like the film. And it has less to do on the film itself, but certain reactions to it, right? So I like the film. But I have been seeing a lot of, in my opinion, short sighted, negative commentary on the film to the point that it isn't really even just criticism, but it's just being critical, right? Hyper critical. And that's why I tweeted out the other day that, our community is really, really stuck in an intellectual and emotional rut in which we just have a sort of like burn it to the ground policy. If this thing isn't perfect, burn it to the ground, it's completely worthless. I think this is incredibly juvenile, short-sighted, and actually irresponsible, to say the least of just being mean-spirited. So, to the reactions to the film, right? So, one of the things that I liked about the film is that it helped to present another way for us to look at Bilal radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, right? So, in my experience, not having been born, right, Muslim, come into Islam, the figure of Bilal is presented as what? Bilal the freed slave. Bilal the freed slave. Bilal the freed slave, slave, right? All, whether, basically, Bilal is a slave, whether he's in slavery or freed, either way, he's the freed slave or the enslaved slave, right? So slavery comes to completely encapsulate everything about Bilal. And I personally, one, as a descendant of people who were enslaved, right? I'm about fourth generation from somebody who was owned by somebody else. That's why you get light-skinned black people like myself that are not the byproducts of loving biracial marriages, right? But rather of the violence of the transatlantic slave trade, specifically rape, right? So that's why I have issues with the Me Too thing, but that's another topic. But it gives us another way of seeing Bilal as a more full human being, right? And by that, so spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it and you don't want to know any details, stop watching now. One of the things in the narrative of how they wrote in the script is very paramount is the relationship between Bilal and his sister and Bilal and his mother, right? Those are two very important plot or narrative points that play a pivotal role of shaping the overall narrative of the film. And because of that, one, we get to see him as more than just slave, right? And again, I think even in America, we talk about, with our history of slavery, as if the slaves were not peoples with like families, histories, and how the act of slavery could rip that apart, right? That emotion of being taken from your mother, having your sister taken from you, right? For me, I was able to very much relate to that narration of how they wrote it in the story about Bilal. So for me, I saw that actually as very important, right? These other criticisms, to be quite honest, about the skin color of Bilal and some of these other so-called historical facts, in my opinion, I see those as secondary. They can be legitimate criticisms, but I see them as secondary and more like blemishes on an otherwise well done piece of work, right? And therefore, a blemish doesn't ruin something. It's just a blemish. And I was making the comparison between Bilal and the Ten Commandments. So as a kid who didn't grow up going to church, but believed in God, TV in some ways served as a church for me in some ways, right? Or some kind of religious institution. So my mom can tell you, I used to watch Frederick Casey Price, who would be broadcast on television. I used to watch his church broadcast. But another thing that I always would be glued to the TV if it came on as a kid was the Ten Commandments. I was enthralled with it. And it was amazing because it was, it's Moses, right? It's the story of Moses. Now, are there problems with the Ten Commandments? Yeah. I mean, you got a bunch of British people playing Egyptians, right? Charlton Heston playing Moses, right? There were very few Jews in the movie, and there were definitely no dark-skinned people. So was it Eurocentrist? Was it perhaps white supremacist? Yeah, undoubtedly, and that is a valid critique. But nonetheless, the Ten Commandments had it's in terms of my development of my religious sensibilities as a child into adulthood, of which I would eventually become Muslim, right, and have a profound belief in God. Ten Commandments was a part of that. To even this day, I own the Ten Commandments, and I enjoy watching it from time to time, even with its kind of laughable white supremacist racism stuff that's in there. It still has value, is what I'm saying, right? Despite its blemishes, the Ten Commandments still has a value to it. And in the same way, Bilal, despite some of the blemishes of, some of the historical inaccuracies, again, to critique Bilal because it's not historically accurate actually is to ignore the disclaimer that the filmmakers make. It's inspired by the figure of Bilal, meaning that what? It's not a documentary. This is not something that's going to be on the History Channel. They're not trying to necessarily stick to the historical facts. So to criticize it on that is to ignore what the filmmakers are saying. Now that they didn't do that, you can say, well, they should have made it a historical thing. Okay, whatever, but they didn't. So you need to critique the film on those versus just keep saying it wasn't historically accurate. It's not as if they set out to make a historically accurate film and failed at it. If they had did that, then that would be a much more legitimate criticism. But what, after the film, we had a Q&A, right, or a little discussion for a moment. And, we asked some of the kids in the audience, what they thought of the film. And I was really struck and moved, as were almost everybody in the theater, right? So there's a young boy, his family, I know his family very well. He's about the same age as my daughter, like 6 or 7 years old. And he was asked, what did he think of the film? What did he get from the film? And his response blew me away. He said, a Muslim has to protect his sister. A Muslim has to protect his mom. And everybody, especially the adults, right? We all got choked up for a minute. It was like such an amazing response. And a 6-year-old child, 6 or 7, right, was able to digest that from the film, right? Just, all of the animation, the fighting, the this and that. The moral that he took from that was ghira, right? To have a sense of protective jealousy. In my book, the film then is successful if it's able to impart that. And again, that comes from more than Bilal being a slave, whether enslaved or freed slave, right? I think that's one of the values, and they were successful in their narration, right? Now, could they have made it more overtly religious? Perhaps, right? But then again, was that their objective? Were they trying to make a religious film, right? And I think this is the mistake of Muslims, are always expecting that everything we're going to do, even in the artistic realm, is going to essentially be religious propaganda. And that's just simply not what the film was. But because it isn't religious propaganda, doesn't mean that it cannot successfully convey, certain values that are undoubtedly religious or spiritual in value, or even more specifically, and I don't use the word very often, Islamic, right? Because of that, I really found the film to be successful, right? People saying, well, Bilal was very dark. Well, here's where I'm going to push back on that, or just give something to consider, right? We have to remember that in these descriptions that we're getting of Bilal, or even of the Prophet ﷺ, or anything else, right? One, these are people that are writing things down, and they're speaking from their perspective of viewing. So, who is describing Bilal as being very dark? Is it Africans that are describing him as being very dark, or were they Arabs, right? Now, yes, not all of the Arabs were super pale white skinned, but at the same time, the Arabs were not, Sudanese, in terms of. So, one thing to consider, and I'm sure somebody's going to freak out, so just go ahead and leave your comment right below. Go ahead and, or stop watching now, right? Is that those descriptions are coming from a particular perspective. So I'll give one example. I remember being surprised one time. I went to high school in which it was mainly white, right? And this is back, and you have to imagine me, 30 years ago or so. Ooh. Right? Just kind of do this, right? A little bit of facial hair, right? But a big afro. Like I had curls, right? Dark curly hair. And, probably, I don't know, maybe a little bit browner. But, pretty much the same complexion, right? And I remember being described by somebody one time as like, as being not dark skinned, but they're like, oh, darker or something. And I'm like the lightest brother on the planet. What do you mean, darker skin, right? But then coming from, it was essentially a bunch of white people making this comment, right? Well, if you're like Irish or Scottish, somebody that's very, very pale skinned, I might indeed seem to be darker, right? So I'm not trying to say that some of these accounts about Bilal, like maybe being part Arab or lighter, are not necessarily spurious. They may be, right? But we do also need to remember those observations are coming from a particular point of view, not from necessarily an African point of view, and they're not a photograph, right? So to me, it's not that they don't matter. They do matter, but they're of secondary importance, and the film should not be graded on A, the skin tone of Bilal, and B, on its historical accuracy, because, it wasn't attempting to do that, right? This is where, again, we circle back around to this obnoxious, juvenile, intellectually sloppy, and irresponsible, burn it to the ground attitude we have about everything in the community, right? I mean, this guy that I understand that produced the film ponied up like 30 mil of his own cash, right? Now, whether he should have spent it on this or that is kind of, that's secondary. The fact that he was willing to spend his own money, and a lot of it, on this thing. And if we continue to have the attitude of like, hey, if it isn't perfect, if it isn't Islamic, if it isn't according to some, I don't know, rubric that we don't even, really have carved out, burn it to the ground, it's useless. We're never going to have we're never going to have these kinds of things. And here's, when I went to the movie, right, and I walked in, I was getting my popcorn, I saw 2 lines of young Muslim kids psyched to be at the movie theater, and psyched to be at the movie theater because it was something Muslim, right? And if you don't understand the value of that, then I really think you are being incredibly short-sighted. That's a very powerful thing for our kids to be able to participate in the norms of culture, like going to the movies, and being able to do it under the general umbrella of something Muslimish, right? I mean, positive message, somebody from Muslim history, right? I mean, we were talked, in our youth group today about the difference between fiqh and motivation. Fiqh is like the facts of things, right? And we said, what is, I asked the kids today, what is the fiqh of Salat al-Fajr? What is the fiqh of praying the morning prayer, right? And they're able to say, well, it has to be prayed between the first light and then before the sun rises, and, it's 2 raka'ah and such and such and such. I said, okay, great. We have the facts established now. Are the facts going to motivate you to get up out of bed in the morning and pray? No. Nobody gets up in the morning motivated by facts. They get motivated by something much deeper. And to tear down and to destroy a thing, a work of art over a blemish, is incredibly short-sighted, and also doesn't understand the importance of motivation, the importance of imagination, particularly for the young people in our community. And we need more things like this. But I'll be honest, if I was this cat and I spent 30 mil, I'd be like ready to tell the Muslims, you can go and shove it where the sun don't shine, man. I'm not saying you can't critique my stuff, but to have this level of hostility and whatnot, to me, it's intellectually sloppy. It's, juvenile, short-sighted, and irresponsible. So I really, I liked it for those reasons. So to end, I will give my one personal criticism of the film. So, the film ends essentially with Bilal going on top of Masjid al-Nabawi, and he begins to call the adhan, right? So Muslims know, right? If a dude starts to stick his ears and his fingers in his ears, right? It's not that he needs a Q-tip, it's right, he's going to call the adhan. And then the film ends, like he doesn't actually call the adhan. And I do feel that is a mistake. One, because that's what Bilal is actually really famous for, is calling the adhan. And two, while I do appreciate of not trying to make a religious propaganda film, I do believe it's a mistake to go to the opposite end and try to completely eliminate overt references of religion, especially when they're central to the character. And Islam, the adhan, these are central to Bilal, right? So even if only just the very final scene, you just hear Allahu Akbar, right? If you just heard that, not even the full adhan, I think that would have been a better creative decision to do. And again, I'm hearing this, third party that, they were worried about alienating a non-Muslim audience with overt religious propaganda. Okay, I can appreciate that. But at the same time, you shouldn't completely leave it out, and that you should be able to also trust your audience that they will be able to get it. And I was saying that, one of the things that's most iconic about Islam to non-Muslims is the call of prayer. As a matter of fact, many non-Muslims will find just an aesthetic beauty in the call to prayer. Even though they don't know what the words are or whatnot, they just, that's a Muslim thing that they do and it sounds nice and pretty, right? So I do consider that to be probably, that's really like my major issue. I felt that was something they could have done better. But even within all of that, right, I thought the film was successful. May Allah Ta'ala bless the people who made it, reward them, and may Allah guide our community to be a lot more gentle and soft, to open our eyes, and inspire those people in our community with the creative ability and talent to make these kinds of things so that we have more of this for our children, because there is a great benefit. Like I said, if a 6-year-old kid, despite the historical facts, despite the this and that, if you can walk away with, I should protect, as a Muslim, I should protect my sister and my mother, as Sheikh George Bush once said, mission accomplished. So feel free to rip me a new one in your comments below. Jazakumullahu khairan. If you haven't seen the movie, do so. Inshallah, see you at the center. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.